today. My name is Emma Plum. I'm the director of 1 Million for Work Flexibility, and we're so pleased to be co-hosting today's event with Third Path Institute as part of their Thursdays with Third Path event series. Joining me today is Jessica DeGroot, president and founder of Third Path, and Jessica is going to be leading our event and hosting a conversation with two true workplace innovators, Lotte Bailyn and Joyce Fletcher. Lotte is the T. Wilson Professor of Management Emerita at MIT Sloan, and back in 1993, Lotte was already warning that the workplace needed to address the false separation between work and family in her book, Breaking the Mold, Men, Women, and Time in the New Corporate World. A decade later, Lotte and Joyce co-authored Beyond Work-Family Balance, Advancing Gender Equity and Workplace Performance, which challenges the notion of work-life balance and calls for an approach of integration instead. Joyce is a distinguished research scholar at the Simmons Center for Gender in Organizations. And we are so thrilled to have these pioneers joining us today. Thank you, Lotte and Joyce, for being here to talk with us. And with that, let me turn things over to Jessica to talk a little more about Third Path.
Wonderful. Well, actually, before we talk about Third Path, let's leave that slide up there about Lotte and Joyce Fletcher. Because they truly are the reason one could argue that Third Path exists. And I feel deeply appreciative of the work that they've done and who they are. So much so that I get filled with emotion when I talk about Lotte and Joyce. So, I mean, truly, when I went to Wharton, it was a miracle that I, 1 year into Wharton, getting my MBA, got to meet Lotte Bailyn, and that she had literally just published Breaking the Mold. And when I read that book and I met Lotte Bailyn, I felt like what I had known all along had already been written, which is that we can really do work and family and leadership and organizations radically differently. And naively, I thought everybody would all of a sudden change and the world would change quickly along with this. But what I discovered then later, working with Lotte and Joyce on some of their groundbreaking research and just admiring the work that they've done for so many years, is that actually the change process is really slow. But what you're going to hear today is that they taught me something back then, something called the dual agenda. And today is going to be kind of a crash course on what the heck is the dual agenda and why it's so critical for making change in the world, and why that simple idea of thinking about how we can do work in a way where we have time for our lives and how it actually makes us more effective at work when we do it this way, that was the seed of such great thinking in general and of Third Path. Because if you think about it, Third Path is trying to say, don't choose work or life, choose a third path, an integrated approach, and you'll have more success at work and life. So thank you, ladies. You really have played a very important role in who Third Path is. So let me now go ahead and put up that slide. So we're an organization that helps people think about how they can redesign work and life to create more time for family, community, and other life priorities. If you're joining for the first time today, we have something every month called Thursdays with Third Path, where you can learn about these great ideas, either on the family side or the work side, and you can also hear our recordings on our website. We actually have lots of resources available for people, including millennials. This year we've been really focusing on how can we help millennials think about these issues, get their careers started on an integrated approach, and keep them supported on that integrated approach throughout the life cycle. So glad to be here. Emma?
Thanks, Jessica. And on our end, 1 Million for Work Flexibility is an awareness campaign around the broad benefits of work flexibility for both employers and employees. We are creating a collective voice on this issue and really working to do that in two main ways. One is that we're uniting the many great organizations already advocating for change in the workplace. There are lots of fantastic groups, along with employers who are really proud to be flexible already. Our coalition started with the founder of this movement, which is Flex Jobs, and we now have more than 100 groups on board, and Third Path was a very early joiner of this group. And then on the other side, we're creating a community for workers nationwide to voice their support for Flex. We want to help educate, mobilize, and offer resources for workers who are looking for more Flex, and also to help normalize flexibility so that it's no longer seen as a perk or an accommodation, but is recognized as a strategic business imperative. So if you haven't done so already, we encourage you to please sign up to join the movement at workflexibility.org and connect with us on social media. And we're, as I said, really thrilled to be co-hosting today's event. So thanks again, Jessica and Lotte and Joyce, for being here, and I'll turn things over to you, Jessica, to get going.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. Glad we can do this together.
Thank you.
Well, speaking of changing the world, that's what Lotte Bailyn really has helped us think about. So Lotte, I want to give us a chance to talk a little about truly groundbreaking work you did and reported on in your book, Breaking the Mold. And what I highlighted on this slide is that we really are talking about something where this is not just because we can create better organizations, better private lives or family lives, but really we're talking about the well-being of our country. And I think that's really true. So tell us a little bit about how did you get involved with this work? What were some of the, maybe one of your favorite case studies where you went into an organization and helped make some change? Tell us a little bit more about the dual agenda. Take your time. We want to hear your story.
Well, it's interesting. I guess it was Emma who mentioned that the original version of this book came out in 1993. Long before anybody was really talking about work and family. And then this second edition, which is the one that you have on the picture, came out in 2006. By that time, everybody was talking about work and family. All these good organizations had started. Jessica, you obviously had started it. But what was interesting, that the main message of the first edition, which, you know, more than a decade previously, that it isn't a question necessarily of changing people, but it really has to do with changing the way that the work is done, had really not changed very much over that period. And so by that time, by the time the second edition came out, Joyce and I and another group and a group of people had already been working in organizations. So we knew a little bit more about how to actually make the kinds of changes that could both make work more effective and also allow people to have a better integration with their work lives and their personal lives. And that's what we really call the dual agenda. You'll hear from Joyce that she has a somewhat different, more interesting way perhaps of talking about the dual agenda, but it has to do with the linking of what goes on in the workplace and how that allows people to lead, to use Jessica's term, more integrated lives.
Yeah, wonderful. And so what were some of those experiments you did? And in particular, help our audience learn why it meant that people worked more effectively after they did follow some of these ideas that you were experimenting around.
Well, the emphasis when we went into our work was twofold, really. First of all, to make people aware that their personal lives and their work lives are closely linked to each other. And typically, you know, when you're at work, you sort of leave your personal life alone. And we try to indicate that there is an intrinsic connection between these two domains. And then we would ask people to consider the work practices that made their lives difficult, not the work practices that weren't efficient, but the work practices that made their lives difficult, And then we would probe with them, well, why are those work practices in place? And often it turned out they're in place because this is the way it had always been done, but work was changing, the workforce was changing, and perhaps these ways of working were not the best ways, even from the point of view of making the work more effective. And then we did experiments with them. And I think we'll be talking about one of them, but there are a number of others we could bring up to see whether changes could be made in such a way that they meet the dual agenda. That is to say, they both make the work more effective, but they also make it easier for people to integrate their work lives with their personal lives.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, I remember, so recently you spoke at a conference, and you know, I always take something away from your conversations and when you talk and present, and you were talking about, I think it was a consulting organization, and there was travel involved, and travel to maybe even some country in Africa, and that there was this kind of realization that there was a leader who would kind of swoop in and travel and cause a lot of problems for his own life to get there. But what surfaced out of the case study was the idea of this kind of hero as leader, and that was part of the culture, was that, you know, you were supposed to kind of drop everything and be the hero and come in and save the day, when that actually wasn't really the most effective way to get the work done. Am I remembering it correctly? And can you tell us a little about what happened in that example?
Yes, that's exactly right. This was a research development that was organization working with the developed world, and it turned out this image of the hero actually undercut one mission of this organization, which was to help the people in the developing world learn how to do the things they were trying to do themselves. But because the people from the home organization were always there, it actually undercut the ability of the people to learn how to deal with the issues themselves. And of course, it was very difficult with all this travel for people to lead any kind of integrated lives. And so it turned out the traveling was neither good for the work and the mission of the organization, nor was it good for the people who had to do the traveling. And as they began to rethink this, they moved into somewhat different modes, which actually was better for the people in the developing world to learn how to do this themselves, and certainly was better for their own lives.
Yeah, yeah. You're actually making me think of a very funny short story. I was being interviewed by an entrepreneur magazine. Can entrepreneurs have a life? And I was trying to explain to them that because you guys had taught me this, I actually felt I made wiser decisions, because I basically was an entrepreneur. I started Third Path, and I had made wiser decisions because I wanted to have a life. And I was giving them a number of examples about how, because I said I want to have a life and run this business, here's why my business runs better today, and talk about paradigm shift. I don't think I actually got quoted in that article, because it was so deeply believed that entrepreneurs have to sacrifice everything that they didn't actually quote me in the article. Does that surprise you, Lotte?
No. It's one of the problems that these ideas get co-opted back into the old assumptions.
Yeah, yeah.
Not easy to change those assumptions.
Yeah. In fact, that's one of the things that we're going to be talking about today, is that what we're really talking about is really challenging deeply held mindsets about how to do work, how we want to develop leaders, and actually what Third Path has learned, you know, how families play into all this. And so you really, it's a messy conundrum that we all have to kind of really step out of and think in a different way. Some of us have an easier time doing that than others. And I joke that I had to learn how to be patient over the course of my career. I bet that's something you've had to learn too, Lotte.
Or I go from pessimism to optimism.
Well, so there's lots more that we could say, and we will be coming back because we actually, the way I set up today's webinar is to kind of ask 3 kind of sticky questions that Lotte, Joyce, and I are still trying to figure out together. So you listening in today will be learning about some of the things that we're still trying to figure out, because, you know, this is not, I always joke, we don't have a crystal ball. We don't know the answers. We're figuring out as we go. So there might be one more thing you want to say, Lotte, before we talk a little bit with Joyce Fletcher, and then we will be going to some of our questions. Anything else, Lotte?
Mm-hmm.
That's great. All right, next slide, Emma, please. So Joyce, thank you too for being here. I think it's through Lotte that I met you and just immediately had wonderful conversations with you because you also brought something very important, which is the lens of how gender plays into this. But you brought a perspective that I felt I didn't see very often. What you brought, Joyce, was an appreciation of that, you have brought an appreciation that what women have done in the world is equally important as men. And it doesn't mean that we want to do it women's way or men's way. You just appreciated the approach that women brought and that families were important. And so I felt like I was talking to somebody who understood that the world I wanted to create was a world where we had time for work and time for these other important things like family, community, etc. You've done some really profound work around gender, although it's not the focus of today's call. If you want to talk a little bit about what you learned about in disappearing acts or some of the other things you've learned around gender. Long story short, what you'll hear from Joyce, though, is that when you have these work norms that people have to work long hours and that's the only way to prove that you're committed, it clearly ends up playing out in a very gendered way. So Joyce, what would be a good place for you to start a little bit about your work or what you've learned around how gender plays out around all this?
I think probably what's most, first of all, thank you for having me on this webinar. It's really listen to all this. I think probably the most relevant thing about my work for this conversation is that my goal was to look at work practices called a gender lens. And by that I didn't mean men and women per se, but really pulling on the idea that many of work practices have developed over time, have gotten really sort of conflated with sort of stereotypical notions of masculinity. And so ways of commitment, creating leadership, have been sort of conflated with these ideal images of masculinity around things like toughness or individualism, authoritarianism, and certainly the unlimited access to time to that work because they're everyone else taking care of the rest of the life. So my approach was really, or my perspective is really like looking at work practices that were not necessarily because they were the best for the work, but because they had sprung up in this time and they were really associated at a very deep level with this masculinity. So men and women could do them, practice themselves, and the relevance for that, as we're talking about how difficult it is to change, and your example before of not being quoted in that article, is that even when rationally you can say, okay, this work practice, for example, the hero comes at the last minute and putting in an all-night pluck a project that's in danger, like and put in all this time so that it gets solved or saved. That sort of heroic image is so inbred that if someone were to try to change those work practices and say, well, we have these crises if we did some planning up front or if we worked as a team beforehand, that everybody could agree with that, and yet it would be very hard to change the kind of positive regard that someone who did come in at the last minute and solve a crisis or pull an all-nighter in order to have something ready in the morning would get from.
So Joyce, what's happening right now? Joyce, I'm going to jump in for a second. We hear 95% of what you're saying, and it seems to be maybe if you're closer to the speaker, we hear it clear. So I'm just going to recap a couple things you said and then let you talk some more. Because what I really hear you getting at is this really powerful concept that many assumptions that we have around what makes a good worker or a good leader are actually kind of stereotypically kind of associated with being masculine, and the idea that, you know, having unlimited access to time as an example of a committed employee, and that, you know, one example of the way this plays out is, you know, people get rewarded for doing an all-nighter as opposed to the person who actually plans ahead and doesn't have to do the all-nighter doesn't get rewarded. In fact, as you talk about in your book, they disappear. So the ones who kind of get recognized are these kind of people who just give lots and lots of time, stay up all night, and that's hard to change in organizations, but it's actually not effective for organizations. So is that a good recap of some of the things you said? And then I want to just make sure I can hear your voice well.
That's perfect. And I don't really, very good summary. The only thing I will, there are many other ways of working.
So for some reason when you're, it seems to, it's actually gotten worse instead of better. I don't know whether you can dial in, and that will be a way we'll add you into the call. Maybe what we'll do while we're figuring this out is I will let Joyce connect with Jen through the chat box and figure this out, and then we will come back to some of this while we can make sure we can hear Joyce very clearly. I'll add a couple things before we go on to the next slide, though. Bottom line, as no surprise to anybody on this caller, when you start looking at outdated assumptions around how we do work, and you're trying to say, hey, maybe we can change these assumptions so we can really work effectively and have time for our lives, that there's ways this plays out in a very gendered way. And so when Lotte and Joyce worked together, they not only looked at the moment around how this was playing out in the workplace, they thought about how this would play out over time around gender and found some very profound things. And we are actually going to circle back to that exact issue as we get a little bit further into today's webinar. So with that in mind, I'm going to have us go to the next slide, which will talk about the 3 questions we're going to be looking at today. And then we're going to jump into some of those questions. So for example, one of the things I said was we think of this as a crash course on the dual agenda. So by the end of this webinar, we hope you'll really understand how to think about the dual agenda in your own personal life or with your work group, and so that you can really make some change. And you're going to hear an inspiring example of how a whole work group made some changes around this. We're also going to look at who's responsible for the problem of too much work. You know, we have these norms of people working long hours. In some ways it's because they feel like it's the only way they can prove they're committed to the organization. And so we're going to be exploring that question of who's responsible for this problem that we're all experiencing of working. Our work now spills into our nights, weekends, vacations, and how do we change that? And then we're going to give some examples about how you make some change. Do we make the change by dictating top down? Do we get a group of people to make a change together, bottom up? Or is this something that can change over the life course? Each time when we look at one of these questions, I'm going to get Lotte to talk a little bit about her thoughts around this. Then hopefully we'll have Joyce also talk about her thoughts around this. Then I'll add a couple thoughts because we really see this as a dialogue between the 3 of us as we think around these issues. So if you don't mind putting the next slide up, that'd be great, please. Okay, so first question, does a dual agenda, in other words, when you try to think about how to do work in a way where you find efficiencies and support an integrated approach to life, does the answer look different in different workplaces? Or to be concrete, I'm done all the way through, I'm going to try to get real concrete. If you telework, do you still need to work 9 to 5? So let's think about that. Next slide, please. What I've done all the way through is I've tried to give some real concrete examples that we can really put our arms around. So Lotte actually worked with this amazing group, a customer service team. I'm going to have her talk a little bit about that in a second. It's a great example of the dual agenda at work. I also work with some amazing leaders who really have promoted an integrated approach for themselves and for the people they work with. So after we hear from Lotte, I'll be talking a little bit about this virtual sales team that I work with. I'm noticing that I'm having a hard time seeing the very bottom of the slide. I don't know if there's a way to adjust that. It's not a problem if we can't see it. So Lotte, who is this customer service team and what happened in it? Tell us a little bit about that and how did the dual agenda play out there?
Well, this was a team in a high-tech company, large high-tech company that was involved with customer service. And the people were really, there were very tight controls that they had to come in at a certain time. They were docked for being late. They had to be there for a certain time. The company had very progressive policies about flexibility. So some of these people who were having a very tough time put in a plan of the kind of flexibility that they needed in order to work better. And obviously this was one-on-one with their manager, but the managers were very nervous. They felt they had to be there whenever the employees were there. The controller was fairly controlling, and so they tended to either pocket these requests. Often they said no, with the result that people stopped making the requests, with the result that management said, see, you don't need them. You don't. So it was this negative cycle. And when we fed this notion of this negative cycle back to the controller, I give him credit because he was very controlling. He had an insight that maybe his whole organization worked on such a negative cycle. And I'll never forget it. This was a team of all the employees, about 300 people, and he was there. And in the middle of our presentation, he said, okay, we'll do an experiment. For 3 months, everybody can work the way they want to, as long as the work gets done. In his usual style, he had not told his managers about this. And so what happened during this 3 months experiment? Well, the first, I think, critical thing is the managers could no longer work one-on-one with each employee, because all the employees, men, women, parents, non-parents, had reasons why they could work better in a different form and in a different way. So they had to let the work team figure this out by themselves, because it was not possible for them to manage all these different kinds of requests. And the work team did. And the result was, well, absenteeism went down by 30%, which was a very good organizational result. And the team learned how to work with each other and to help. In this team negotiation, they had to give in some ways. They had to talk it out until they figured out how they could best get the work done in the best way for each person to be as productive as they are able to, given what their non-work situation was. And so I think the collective nature of arranging flexibilities is very important, and that the one-to-one, and Jessica, I know you may disagree with this, but that the one-on-one employer with supervisor is much more difficult.
Yeah, well, clearly, because what was happening is that they were asking someone who didn't believe inside of an organization then didn't believe, and that's really hard. Absolutely, I would 100% agree that in organizations where there are not really supportive and managers are not supportive, it's pretty hard to get flexibility to happen. So, and what's so great about this is a 300-person work group that you got change to happen. And I think another amazing takeaway, Lotte, was I was rereading this case study that the leader, you really changed the leader's mindset from this process. Is that a good summary too? That the leader's mindset really changed too?
Yes, I think so. I think, and I give him great credit that he was willing to do this experiment. And I think defining it as an experiment is another important point.
Yes.
You don't change the world from one day to the next, but you say over these 3 months, we're going to see how this works.
Yes.
And that means he's giving them time to try it out, see how it works better, giving them a chance to not do so well for a while and then evaluate it.
Yeah, yeah. Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, I want to briefly talk about this virtual sales team because there's a little slight difference in this that I think is a kind of a fun difference. That's when I talk about is the dual agenda going to look slightly different in different organizations or different types of work. This is a 16-person sales team, completely virtual. Not every sales team in this organization was virtual, but this one was virtual. And basically what we've gotten to know this leader very well. He's one of our pioneering leaders. In fact, if you went to our website and went to the Meet the Pioneers page, that's what it says at the bottom of this slide, you would actually be able to read about this particular leader. And long story short, what's interesting about this case study is that if you think about sales, there's no limit to how much sales you could do. If you could do sales 24 hours a day, you'd earn more money for yourself and the organization. So there's no boundary to how much sales you could do. But what he had figured out and what the organization had figured out was that you actually don't work well if you're constantly working. And so the organization, the leader, and the team all worked together to think about what was the right amount of work. And we're going to circle back to that later in the discussion today because many of our jobs don't have limits. Like the customer service team, I'm guessing had sort of like there's times when you were answering calls and times you're not answering calls. Whereas sales, you could really keep on working. And so what we're going to be talking about is different types of work have different solutions. However, if you go to the next slide, both of these types of work are places where you could work virtually, not necessarily the one that Lotte was working with, but there are customer service places where it's done virtually. There are sales teams, this one in particular, that works virtually. Interestingly, when we go back to that question, do you have to work 9 to 5? Do you work in a virtual setting or work telecommute? In the sales team, you have to work at a certain time for part of your work because you have to contact people and you have to contact them during normal business hours. And I'm guessing customer service, it had some specific times it had to work too. So what we're hopefully starting to get you to think about is when you're looking for a dual agenda solution, something that supports you to be working effectively and have an integrated approach to life, it's going to look different in different organizations, how people solve it. There might be something you want to add to that, Lotte. You don't have to. I'll also check if we've got Joyce back on the call in a second. Any thoughts you want to add about that, Lotte?
No, I think you've said it.
Okay, great. Just checking if we've got Joyce back on the call with us.
Yes, I called in.
Okay, super. Wonderful. We hear you loud and clear now. Wonderful.
Okay, great.
So you probably got to hear a little bit about Lotte's great example with the 300-person team and how they make change, lasting change, and how I talked about my virtual sales team and how they are actually doing well. In fact, they've been the 3-time winner of the best sales team at this organization. Cool. We're going to go on to question number 2, and Joyce will get you to get some thoughts in there when we get to question number 2. All right. So another question, who is responsible for the problem of too much work? Is it something that the individual needs to take responsibility for, the leader or the organization? And how do we know when enough work is done? Because I think one of the problems is, especially in today's world, is that work is spilling into nights, weekends, vacations. So we're going to talk a little bit about this on our next slide, if you want to put that one up. So what I was talking about is that the customer service work and the small customer service work and that sales team have kind of, they can do some of their work at certain times, but they can't do it at other times. So the customer service work, you're either doing that work or you're not doing that work. It's not work that you can keep on doing at home later on. It's bounded work. And why I raise this up is because in workplaces where it's very bounded, like you're a nurse, you're a doctor, you're a school bus driver, when work is very bounded, it's very clear when you're working and when you're not working, and you can really set some limits around it. Another example is, I won't go into it much now, but we work with another amazing leader who runs a small manufacturing workplace, and it has very bounded work as well. You're either doing that work, you're literally there working on these very specific scientific equipment projects, or you're not there doing the work. And obviously when you have bounded work, it's very clear when you're doing your work, and it's very clear when you're not doing your work. That's not the problem. But when you go to the next slide, there's other workplaces where it's unbounded. How much work you do, there's no limit to it. And I want to talk a little bit about this with Lotte and Joyce, because one of the discussions that's been out there in the world is, should we focus on results or should we focus on time? And I'm guessing there's a little bit of both, but I know that you've talked a little bit about, there was the Rowe experiments, the results only workplace experiment. Any thoughts about, Lotte, let's start with you. When you've been out there getting people to think about the dual agenda, have you had much discussion about whether you focus on results or time? What have you guys been learning around this idea of how do you know when you've done enough work? And let me know if what I'm saying makes sense.
Yeah, no, I understand. And the answer clearly is it should be results. But the problem is that time is easier to measure in what you call unbounded work than results are. So people tend to use time not only to measure performance, productivity, but also commitment. And so without realizing that time itself can lead to inefficiencies. So for example, if you curtail time with the same amount of work, typically people can figure out a way to do it. Because if you just throw time at problems, you get to the issue where people are too tired, they can't think seriously, and they're not being at all efficient. So in fact, there are some advantages to constraining time, not only for the people doing the work, but for the quality and the innovativeness and creativity of the work itself. But our society is based on time and clock time. And so it's a real social problem of how to shift to what you might call task time, and there are certain tasks that need to be done, and sometimes like income tax people at around this time have to work very hard and probably long times, but there are other periods where work slackens, but our sense of how much time people should play at work doesn't seem to respond to the tasks, but responds to our assumption of what work time is. And they're hard to change. But I think clearly results are what matter, not time put in.
Well, that's the fun part of what we get to talk about. And I want to get Joyce's thoughts on this in a second, because I think what I've learned, Lotte, and that's what I promised today, is that you and I might have some slightly different perspectives here, and that's a good thing, is that I've actually learned that I think it's not quite just results. And I know I'm an outlier when I say that. So I'm going to tell you a little information, get your thoughts on it, and then get Joyce's perspective. But if you look at that small law firm, what Lotte's getting at is that, in each different type of work you do in that small law firm, you approach it slightly differently. So this small law firm is actually this really progressive workplace out in Colorado. Another one of the lawyers that we work with, leaders that we work with, And what he's learned is that, he approaches this concept of time and results slightly differently. So with the lawyers, there is an expectation that there's going to be this ebb and flow of work, and that they will have a lot more flexibility, but their work will be significantly higher when there's that peak period. And that's kind of what they're contracting and agreeing to, is that there's going to be this ebb and flow, and it's about the kind of more focus on results, not just strictly. Lawyers obviously charge by the hour. And then in contrast, the administrative people, what he's learned, it's really what they're interested in is they need to have someone there so that when they have a question or something done from an administrative task, they're physically present, but that there's, for the most part, they have more predictable hours. And that's actually something that the administrative people really appreciate, is that they can kind of know that their workday will end at a certain time, and that they can get to the other things that they need to get to. And so we've been learning that it kind of depends on what kind of jobs people have, whether you focus on results or time. In fact, I would argue, I want to hear your thoughts about this, even at a place like Third Path, where we really support people to work in a flexible way, I've learned it's really hard to know what's the right amount of results. And so sometimes what we really do is focus on time, and we say, hey, this is how much I'm trying to work in a week, and I'm going to do my best to get my work done in that time. And we're also clear about what's their most important work. So we found a way to combine looking at results and time as a way to better manage things. How much of that makes sense, Lotte? What do you think about it? And then I want to get Joyce's thoughts.
Yeah, no, I actually agree with that. I think by you're constraining time, you get people to actually work more efficiently, be more creative about how they work. The problem with time is when you assume that it's infinite, and any kind of problem you have, you just throw time at it. That's what gets you into trouble. Here you're emphasizing the tasks that people do, and you're constraining the time, and therefore asking them to be creative about how they can do their work most efficiently within that time constraint.
Yeah, actually, it reminded me of something we said years ago. We said we want, instead of, there was always that expression, quality time with our kids, we want quality time at work, quantity time for life, which isn't, who knows if you want quantity time for life, but certainly quality time at work makes a lot of sense. Joyce, you've been listening in. Thank you. How do you want to chime in on this results versus time? And any thoughts about how this plays out with gender, too?
But certainly on opportunities for dual agenda change, I think if you're starting to think about time, where teams and people working together, if you're really examining the ways in which you're working interdependently, that's a place where a lot of time can be saved and people can change some of the work practices. So, whether it's planning together, because there's only so much you can do as an individual in terms of how you use your time. If you think about how you are interdependent with other people on your team or in your organization or whatever your work group is, if you are working in that way where you are interdependent with other people, then that can really sort of be the mother lode of change. You can begin to look at how you're working together and to be more efficient. Because so often our work, what we're doing in our individual work is dependent on someone else either giving us input or waiting for our output. And those are the little places where I think you can really make some lasting changes.
Wow, wonderful. So you're raising another thing we're talking about is that it's, constraining time, it's focusing on results, and the role that working as a team to think about that. There's some unique opportunities when teams think together about this, of putting some processes in place and actually following through on those processes that are uniquely available to the team that you can't get to unless you look at it from a team perspective. So that's very true. Thank you, Joyce. I like that point. I think there's a role that individuals play too. We can talk about that in a second. I think leaders also play a role. because leaders need to get smarter about what is the capacity of their team. Are they asking too much of their team? And that we actually have learned a lot from some of our leaders, this idea of chronic versus episodic overwork. And so in order for a person, a team, an organization to avoid chronic overwork, I'd argue that we need to get everybody to do their part, the individual, the team, and the leaders, to get smarter about what's realistic. Joyce, maybe I'll start with you. Anything you want to add about these ideas that you've learned around time and results, and then I'll ask Joyce.
No, I think I love these ideas of, or this concept of the difference between chronic overwork and episodic overwork, because I think that really gives a very good perspective in terms of looking at places where you can make some changes.
Yeah, yeah. And in fact, one of the things that's really happened when Ben Applegate kind of came up with this term, he also is one of the leaders we've been working with. He said, you know, what he's really learned in his organization is that the slower periods for each individual and for the team and for the leader are as important as the busier periods. As a lawyer, his firm makes money during the peak periods. But what he's learned is during the slower periods, he can mentor somebody who needs some help on something. He can delegate more. He can put some systems in place. And so he's such a smart guy. He realized that, yes, we make our most money in the peak periods, but the slower periods are equally important for doing that kind of thing that you're talking about, getting the team to work more effectively, getting a person to work more effectively. Lotte, any thoughts about time and constraining time and results, or this slide right here before we go on to the next question?
Yeah, the only thing I would add that I like the episodic overwork, but is it predictable? I mean, so predictability is another very important aspect. That's really what Leslie Perlow learned in her work.
Yeah.
That isn't even so much the long hours, it's the predictability of the peaks.
Yes.
So just want to throw that in.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, what you're getting at is what causes people to have too much work, or what causes better or worse workflow is one of those exact things, Lotte, is the predictability of it. So someone who's like an accountant has a very predictable workflow. Someone who's a consultant has a much less predictable workflow. And that really can throw havoc as people are trying to balance work and other life responsibilities. Perfect. So maybe we'll have to have another webinar where we look at predictability. All right, I'm going to go on to the third question. All right, so one of the things that we've talked about for years, the three of us, is how do you make sustainable change? And it's been hard to figure out how you make sustainable change. And so this is really what we're going to talk about next. So if you put up the next slide. And basically what we really saw from Lotte's example is that it was, I'd say this looked like it was sustainable change too, that you got a department to change, a leader to change their mindset, and that really you were able to get them to think in a smarter way and have that last. Has that been something that's been complicated in the work you've done of creating sustainable change, and what do you think's at the heart of making it harder or less hard? Let's start with Lotte and then ask Joyce.
Well, it certainly has been. I agree with you. This particular example, although we haven't followed it up, but for the time we knew was sustainable. But we had other examples where we had very good short-term success, and as soon as we left, the old assumptions and the old structures and culture co-opted it, or a new manager comes in, who does things differently. So by working with work teams, you can really get at these work practices that need to be changed. But how to diffuse that throughout an organization? What we found is that you cannot really diffuse a solution, because it's the process of going through the thinking that leads to a solution that seems to work in that situation. And if then another team comes along and says, oh, we'll do that solution, but they haven't rethought, they haven't gone through the process of rethinking why they work the way they do, the solution may not work. So it's a tough situation. And I think your approach, Jessica, of starting with leaders are very important. And
Yeah.
how you do that in the very large organizations where we tended to work, you know, it's more complicated, but still,
Yes.
it's important.
Amen. Amen. Actually, I mean, I shouldn't say this, but I've kind of given up on large organizations. Instead, I try to look for pockets of change inside large organizations. And many other organizations are still struggling too, even smaller ones. Well, Joyce, what would you say that you've learned around sustainability? I'm going to put up some case studies that you learned that will talk about how people maybe are figuring this out in their lives, but what have you learned about sustainability? What makes you more or less hopeful, Joyce, around some of these experiments?
Well, I think what makes it so difficult is that we really are challenging some very deep-seated norms about particularly how you demonstrate competence or commitment. So I'm thinking of a change that came through in the way Lotte described. We brought people through the question of what makes life, what about your work makes it difficult to have a life. And the team themselves uncovered some dysfunctional practices. And one of them was that if a manager would ask for some information, that he or she only needed a small or a brief summary in order to demonstrate their commitment, or people would give like a 5-page PowerPoint with all kinds of bullets. So when the manager was really only looking for a back of the envelope kind of response. So they were able to make some changes around that and come up with some innovative things. But within months, people were again looking for a way now to demonstrate their extraordinary commitment. And so the norm just slowly reinstated itself. And I think that's what we have found to be the most difficult, is that if you're challenging some deeply held assumptions about how you demonstrate commitment or how the work should be done, it's very, very, very difficult to sustain that over the long haul.
Yeah. And, and again, not that I feel like I have the perfectly hopeful example, because even the example I'm about to give is got some flaws. But if you go to the next slide, in Lotte's book, she gives 3 case examples, and one of them is an example of somebody that Third Path introduced to her, and he's one of the many people we worked with over the years who's really followed this integrated approach his entire life. But not just that he followed it, he worked with his partner at home. So he and his wife both were thinking about an integrated approach. And so what I've seen, the hopeful part of this story, is that these integrated professionals have now turned into integrated leaders, and they are really influencing change in their organizations. So even though it's a slow process to support these professionals to follow an integrated approach, it looks like it's very sustainable and they can have big influence today, 10 years into this process. But it did take courage for them to go ahead and try to do something different. They literally had to say, you know what, I'm going to take this risk. I might not be seen as competent or as committed when I try to do my work differently, and I'm going to take this risk to do it differently. And that's not something everybody wants to sign up for. However, what we are really seeing at Third Path is once you get past that risk, you keep on following that integrated approach, and you're supported at home to do that, you can have a lot of influence, and we're seeing our leaders have a lot of influence today. If you go to the next slide, I'll talk about why I think this is happening. So what I think's happened is that, yes, they had to take this risky decision as an individual early in their careers, that bottom left box, where they wanted to do work differently. They wanted to flex their work. They wanted to work less hours and have time for life. But what I've seen is they've moved ahead into that middle box where now they're supporting a whole team of people around them as an integrated leader and supporting more change. And what we've even seen, that one small law firm out in Colorado, they've really become this fully integrated workplace where everybody can follow an integrated approach to work and life. So we are seeing some real success with these leaders, but like I said, it's slow, it requires a risk. We want to have faster change if we can. So I hope we don't end with that as the only way we can create sustainable change. There's lots more we could say. We're going to skip 2 slides ahead to our last thoughts slide. So again, I want to thank Lotte and Joyce. You guys really, I stand on your shoulders. I stand on the work that you've done. I wish we could see a lot more change since 1993 when you first wrote that book, but I sure am appreciative of what you taught me. Is there any last thoughts you'd like to add, Lotte? And then I'll ask Joyce.
No, I just appreciate the work that you do, and I sometimes feel, you know, I've done what I can. I have to leave it to the next generation.
Well, that's exactly right. Maybe we can even talk about that for a second, about how to help those millennials. Joyce, is there any last thoughts you have?
Well, just that I think what Third Path is doing is so important, because you really are focused on there needs to be change in both spheres, in both domains, the work and the family. And that we focus so much on challenging assumptions about how you, quote, do work. But I think you have raised the whole issue and made such great progress on challenging some of these deep-seated assumptions about how we, quote, do family.
Yeah.
So I think it's very, you know, it's really path-breaking work, what you're doing.
Oh, well, thank you. I didn't expect to get compliments back. Well, maybe that's what we can close with, is a thought for the millennials, because I think if I had a wish for the millennials, what I've seen is, I know it feels like a slow process, but it's interesting. And tell me whether you guys agree with this. So I will check one more time with Lotte and Joyce after I say the following sentence. My hunch is that when you and your partner get clear about the life you want, and you support each other to keep on striving for that life, especially in today's world, yes, it might feel risky. Yes, it might mean leaving some workplaces because they're just never going to change. But and yes, it's going to mean some months, or even in my case, this past year when my balance was terrible, you know, just terrible. So it's not like you get it right every day, but if you have a lot of support at home, if you're a single person, you have a good friend that you get support from. If you just get good support to keep on track with what you want, it's really quite amazing what you can have happen. And to not let the workplace change your imagination of what's possible, but keep on getting support around you. Join the Third Path community. Join 1 Million for Work Flexibility. Get support to keep on striving for that integrated goal. And remember that when you do it differently, you're not saying you want to do work poorly. You want to do work more effectively. That's what Lotte taught us. Any last words, Lotte? None required, and then I'll check with Joyce.
No, I think you summed it up very well.
Wonderful. Joyce, any last thoughts?
Ditto. I think you did a beautiful job.
Well, thank you, everybody, and thank you, both of you, for your very innovative, pioneering, profoundly important work. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it.